All right, well, it is 2:30, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. We are on webinar number 27, I believe. And last week, not last week, 2 weeks ago, Kevin talked about the new project-wise files that were introduced, the civil working, and then the publish files. So today, I'm going to go through a little bit of a workflow on how to work with those. It's not a little bit. I'm not even sure I'll get through it, but we'll see. I haven't timed it. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got these two new files. I think everyone on here is probably familiar with this, but I'll go through it just in case someone is not. So we have our terrain base container file. That is a 2D file that is created with the seed 2d.dgn seed file. And that is what our basemap and terrain file is being delivered as. So whether you have one terrain or 15 terrains, you are going to deliver it in this container file. And then this file, this container file, is then referenced by the designers where they go and target the different terrains to do their work. It resides in the number 6 civil data folder. And there is no survey data in the file. It only has references, and it references those TERR terrain published files or the FEAT feature published files. And a terrain needs to be set active to create the managed 3D model so that it can be used by the designers downstream. And then our two new files that we've got, this terrain pub, is a published data file. So this is going to contain our delivered or published survey field books and terrains. And then this file is then referenced to that terrain base container file. And the data is visible. The data in this pub file is visible and used by the downstream users. So it resides in our survey data, and it has what I would call our, I guess, live data in it. And then we have the new civil working file, which is just a working file for editing field topo files or point cloud mapping or anything else that you want to do outside of that live terrain published file. So yeah, like Evan said, I think the workflow is a lot better than the way we had it before, but there will still probably be some kinks that need to be worked out. So everyone has seen the swim lanes that Lenny does in her webinars. So I'm trying to do the same thing with that here. So as I mentioned before, we have our, let me get my laser pointer up there. In our number 6 civil data folder over here on the left, we have our terrain base container file. That should be really the only file as far as terrains go from survey that we have in this number 6 civil data folder. Again, this is our container file with the delivered base map and terrain, but it has no data in it. And you've got to have that active terrain with that managed 3D model to make it usable for the downstream users. So attached or referenced to that terrain-based container file are all of these new files. So we've got the terrain pub, we've got the feature pub files. So all of those are referenced to this terrain-based container file. They will contain what I call our live data that we want to deliver. And these reside within our survey discipline folder. And then to get our data into these pub files, we created these civil working files. So in this example, I've got a civil work, just number there, but pretend that's civil work 01. And I would use that for processing my field topo files initially, maybe. I would have another civil work file. If I were going to be doing some point cloud or topo dot mapping for my terrain, I would have another civil working file for that. And then I would probably have another if I were doing 2D mapping for point cloud work. So I would have my working field book for all of that topo dot mapping in another civil working file. And then that data would go from these working files up to this publish file which is then, of course, referenced to my base container file for delivery when we're ready for that. So depending on the type of data that we've got, here I've got point cloud, topo dot mapping for terrain. That may go in my terrain publish 01 or 02, depending on what it is. If I have existing topo, I can put some of it over here. Maybe some of it goes into my bridge deck, my pub02, or whatever other file that is. Same thing with like my field topo files. A lot of that's going to go in this existing topo file for publication, but some of it may also go in this pub02 for the bridge deck. And then for my other mapping that I don't want to be in a terrain, I'm going to have this civil working file where I'm extracting features, maybe making some modifications. I'm going to put those up in these feature pub files because I am not making a terrain from those. Some regions do this differently than others as far as utilities go. I know some people have drainage models and utilities in separate models. That can go in another feature pub file. You can have a civil working file for that as well to do all your modifications. Once you've got it to a place you like it, you can then put it in that pub file. And there's variations on how you can do this. And then we're going to talk about today dealing with a new area that you've got as well. You can create a new civil working file for that, move your data up to the publish file when you're ready for it to be delivered, and then attach it to your terrain-based container file. Evan, is that kind of the process you guys have been using, or have you been using a slightly different process?
Doing the pub drawings is what I've been doing. Hadn't done anything with the civil work ones yet, and trying to get my head around what's going to be the safest way to update the pub files when we have add-on survey requests and we have to shove stuff in, because I don't want to break the rules that designers will create off of our line work in the existing or in the pub and the right-of-way drawings.
Right. So you're doing all of your work in the pub file right now, pretty much, it sounds like.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Is everyone else kind of doing the same? I see Logan. I don't know if you guys, what's everybody else doing? Are you guys working directly in the pub files, or are you doing civil work files?
I think it depends. John, I've seen using the civil work files, particularly for topo dot stuff.
Okay.
I don't know that we've run into that situation of adding a section of topo to an existing file yet. How we get there, I'm not positive, but I have seen quite a few of those civil work files, but mostly for 2D point cloud mapping and or topo dot stuff.
Okay. Good. Well, hopefully after today, maybe you have a different view of how to do this. And I do have a process for updating this. So hopefully you guys don't yell at me too much. But so this is kind of the workflow that I see for that initial base map and terrain delivery. So let's say you've got a project and you've got, it's, medium-sized project. It's not small. This can all vary based upon the size of your project. If you just have one topo file, two topo files, there's nothing wrong with going straight to that pub file and doing the work there. But this is kind of a little bit bigger. You've got several topo files, you've got point cloud mapping, different things that you're going to be all trying to put together here. So this is just kind of how I see it working and how I would do it, just to keep everything straight. So on the left side here, get my laser pointer, and I've got two different lanes here to get to the same result. So we've got, let's say, 5 different topo files. So what I would do is I would create a civil work file, and I would either create 5 different survey field books for each one of those topo files, or one field book with all of those merged into that, all of those different topo files merged into that one survey field book. And this is going to depend on how your office works. If one person is always processing all this data, you could probably go into this one survey field book where you're managing all the different topo files through there. If you've got maybe the field crew likes to process the topo files and make some edits, then they can export that topo file as an SQLite. You can then, or whoever's processing it, the analyst, can go through into that civil work file and bring it into some of these survey field books. Again, you can choose the different ways to do it. It doesn't really matter either way, whatever you feel most comfortable with. But from those different survey field books, you could then export an SQLite of each one of those. And if you're going through this route, and in your terrain pub file, you would then have your one existing topo field book that you then import all those SQLites into, and then create your terrain, do some final touches on your field book, and then you should be good to go because you've made some edits back in this, the majority of the edits probably, but then you're going to have to do a few more in this method here to get it into the terrain pub. If you're using this method down here, you've got the one survey field book with all those topo files merged into it, into your civil work. You've then got the ability to do a lot of merging and different things. So you can have it pretty much set in the civil working file. And then when you're ready to deliver it, you can just copy it, use the copy to in ProjectWise, and then rename it to your pub file. So you got your pub file, it's ready to deliver. You could run your confidence points on it in the pub file and create your container file and deliver it. It's kind of two different ways. Kind of depends on how your office works as to what's probably going to work best for getting it all to one published file. There is another way you can do this, and that is to bring all the topo files or point cloud mapping that you have directly into the terrain pub file from the start. So you are essentially bypassing the civil working files for this initial Basemap delivery file. So this method is going to work best if there is just one person doing all the processing and Basemap grooming. So if you have multiple people processing field topo files or mapping from point clouds and then passing it on to someone else for merging into one Basemap, going directly to the pub file this way may not be the best option. So in that case, I would process the topo files and the point cloud mapping in those civil working files like I mentioned in the previous slide. One downfall to going directly into the pub file is that this file will be the live file once it is referenced to the container file. So any notes or other working processes that you use to build your field books and terrains will need to be turned off, since again this is a live file, or they're going to be visible to the downstream users. So one example of when this may be problematic is if you're working with the survey point locators. So for the delivered file, you should have the points turned off on your linear features, such as the break line, striping, or even linear utility features. You should also turn off the levels for terrain points and break lines, and then even the level for those survey point locators. So if you have to go back and add data to the terrain pub file, you will likely need to turn that data back on for file grooming and merging when adding the new topo data. And depending on the amount of time it takes to groom those files that you have to add, these working processes may be visible to the downstream users, since they likely will be actively referencing your file and potentially even actively using it as you're updating it. So the benefit of having that working file with all this existing data in it, as I referenced in the previous slide, is that you can do a lot of your editing in that and then just move it up to your pub file. But going directly to your pub file, skipping that civil work file at the initial Basemap delivery is perfectly acceptable as well. Any questions on that?
I keep forgetting what we lose with the SQLite process. If we get everything all clean in civil work, train them, change them to SQLites, there's a piece that doesn't translate.
There is one piece, and that's part of another slide, but I'll go ahead and mention it now since you brought it up. That's the VBA macros. So the VBA macros, there is a workaround to get them from one survey field book SQLite file to another survey field book. It's not not too painful, but it would add another step. Or you could wait to do all your VBA macros once you've got it in your pub file and it's all merged together. I mean, you could either do it here, or if you do it here, it's going to copy over because you're just copy to and renaming it to this pub file. If you do it up here in this place, you would need to do the workaround to get those VBA macros to the new field book over here. So just some options for how to create that initial pub file. But yeah, it's the VBA macros, and that's about it. And Bentley is very well aware of that. They have a critical, whatever that means, critical defect filed on it, and it should be updated with the next release. But when we get that, you know, I have no control over. So that's not going to be a problem forever. The terrain-based container file, it, of course, once you've got that pub file or that feature file or whatever it is, that terrain-based container file, you're going to deliver it, and it's going to be in use by the project team. So it is, and you know, it's live data. Your pub file is also delivered because it's a reference to that container file. So it is also live data. So the problem becomes that we want to keep the same terrain file and survey field book to mitigate those lost connections for downstream users, like Evan was saying. So the workflow that we use to update these is going to depend on a few things. But before we do that, I'm going to jump back and do a demo, kind of of how I see this working right here. And I'm going to try to do this in ProjectWise. I know it kind of messes up whenever we're sharing, but we'll try it. So we have created a demo user training folder in ProjectWise. I'm going to try and use it to do this process. So I'm going to be working in my survey folder for most of this. And I've already created a lot of these files that I want to show you. So I'll try and go through the process, but just be aware that they're all created. You're not obviously going to have all these created. So I have several CSV files that I've imported. These are my Infinity files. I've imported them into ProjectWise. And I want to, I've highlighted them here. I want to bring those into a civil work file. Instead of going directly into my pub file, I'm going to do a little bit of editing on them. Maybe I'm the field crew leader and want to pass them on to someone else. So I'm going to create that civil working file, that civil work, and I'm going to go ahead and call it 01 because I'm doing my existing topo field files. So I have already opened that file. And before I said, you know, there were several ways you could do this depending on how your office works. So I went ahead and did it with a field book per topo file, just because I don't know. I guess maybe I'm still holding on to the way I used to do things in En-ROADS. Maybe it's not totally necessary to do this, but you could very well do a merge field book here as well. So I, you know, created a new field book, imported that CSV file into my field book, made any edits. One of the things I did with this was I went ahead and just exported my confidence points from that. And I've already done this from T02, T10, T21. But let's say I got down here to T22 and I wanted to export all of my confidence points out of that. I can do that with this method. You could do it with the combined field book method as well. So I just selected all those through my details, exported them, and then I created a new field book down here for my confidence points, just to keep a running list of all my confidence points. And then I would delete them out of this topo file. And that's easy enough to do. So with your survey details open, you could select them. Can export those as a SQLite. Choose where I want to do it. For demonstration purposes, I'm not going to do it through ProjectWise. Am I in T21? Yeah, T22. So again, I don't think this is probably anything new, but then with those exported as an SQLite, I can then delete them out of this topo file. And then in my running confidence points field book, just import that just as a way to keep them separated. I can go through and take out my control this way from each file. So T22, if I had a bunch of strategic points I wanted to pull out there because I didn't want them in my existing topography, I could do the same thing, go in and pull them out, throw them in another field book using that SQLite method. I can make different modifications to this in here. So let's say I had some notes, some attribute pairs I needed to add or modify. I can do all that through my survey details. And that attribute pairs are and descriptions are all going to export and import just fine with the SQLite. It's just the VBA macros that are not. So at this point, I would probably hold off. But I would go through each one of these, make whatever modifications I can, and then export that SQLite. So once I have all these done, I can then create that published file. And I have created it here. This terrain EPUB-01. Once I got to a point where I could start building that, I could create it. So I'll go ahead and open that one. And I've already done that here, but in this terrain PUB-01, again, we haven't delivered this yet. So it's all new data. We'll wait for it to load. So in this terrain EPUB-01, I would create my existing topography field book and then just start importing those SQLite files. So you can see I've imported them all. I've got some. So you can just right click on this existing topography, import Bentley survey format, because I've saved those T files from that civil working as SQLites within ProjectWise. So that's these here. So I would just go through and start adding those in. I could start combining them and merging them in my terrain EPUB-01 file. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to do that. I've already done it. But once I had that all set, let me cancel out of this, and I'm going to take a couple more of these out that I meant to take out before this. I'll leave them. I'll just turn them off for now. Well, all right. So once I was satisfied with this, I could create my terrain from it. So I think we all know how to do that. You can right click, create terrain model, and you have your existing topography terrain model. So this is what you are ready to deliver. You've got that all set. You've got all your points turned off in your existing topography field book under your all point features, which I did not do here, but you could go through and turn off your points, break lines, points for all of these on the point features, besides things that are actual points. So you wouldn't want to turn off things like inlets, stuff like that. But we've been told that this makes it work a lot better for downstream users by doing that. And all it does is turn off those point locators. Is anyone doing this? Is everyone doing this?
I'm doing that. I think most everybody in region 2 is.
Okay. So you just go through there and turn off those points that are not actual points. And there is a way to do it with zones and filters, but that's another whole webinar, something we need to get set up. So I can go in and turn off my levels that I don't want to display. A lot of times we don't need to display all the random points. We don't need to display the break lines. depending on what your designers want. You can turn some of that off. Notice I don't have any confidence points here because they are going to be in that civil working. But if I were going to run my confidence points, I would run them in this pub file. So I would create a new field book in here with those confidence points and run it against my terrain in this pub file. So with this, good to go, set up. I've done all my editing. I merged it. I ran my confidence points. I've QC'd it all. I'm good to go. So now I can go create that container file. So I was going to delete. I added some data to this just to kind of show you how I would do it. So I was going to delete that before I created the container file so you can see the container file update. So but let me get in here. There we go. So there's my original data. So this also has all the point cloud mapping that I did from it. I just kind of glossed over that, but the majority of our mapping for this particular project was actually from the point cloud. So all these T files, we had a bunch of them, but the majority of the mapping was from the point cloud. So what I would have done there is back in project-wise, I would have created another civil working file. So this civil work 02 to do my point cloud mapping. That file would have been created with the seed topo dot. I can go ahead and try and open it and show you that. So this is all the mapping that we did from point clouds. At the time, we didn't have topo dot when we did this, but I think everybody now is pretty much using topo dot all the time for their point cloud stuff. So I've got a field book in here, but I'm going to go ahead and turn those off. And I created this with the seed topo dot seed file. And let me invert these. And all the stuff that I mapped from topo dot from the point clouds, I've got on our field code levels. So if I go hover over this white skip, notice it is on level white skip. And I have all those levels in here for all the different things that we mapped. So I would then use my feature code export tool to export all these features, create that CSV file. And then I would just like to test things and just make sure everything looks good. So I would create a field book in here for my point cloud mapping and import that CSV to it, which is what I've done here. And I can easily go invert this again, and I can see all of my field codes in all my features in the survey field book. You can rotate this around, check it out, make sure everything's legit. I got some trees floating up in the air, but lots of different things. Also, you can, splice out your bridge data. If you have bridge, this particular one did have bridge data. So I created a new model. And again, you have to be careful with models in open roads, especially if you're dealing with civil data, survey field books and such. But I'm not in this other model. I'm just doing it to get that topo dot mapping out. So I just copied all of my bridge line work to a different model. And then I can use that same feature code export to get that CSV of all that bridge line work so that I can use it in my survey field book. So back in my default model, I just created 2 field books just to kind of check the data. I could add that data. I could add to the data, descriptions, different things if I didn't get it initially. And then I can export those as SQLite files. Or if my text files are good enough, I can bring those straight into a pub file. So I created a separate pub file for my bridge, which you need to do for a different terrain. I created a separate model for that, brought in my CSV from my topo.mapping. And I also brought in my CSV from my topo.mapping into for the other existing topography for that existing topography pub file. So hopefully that is not too confusing. So that's how I would handle the different types of mapping. So if I got all my topo.mapping, I would have a different civil work file there for that. 2D mapping, same thing. I create I'm going to keep backtracking. 2D mapping, I do the same thing. I created a civil work 03 file for my 2D mapping, did all the extraction. And then I created this feature pub 01 because we're not making a terrain out of that, and then imported that into a survey field book in this feature pub 01. I can go ahead and open that so you can see it. And I know one of the things that I've kind of struggled with is why are we doing all these different files? But depending on if you had a small project, you could probably have all this in probably a lot fewer files. But when you get bigger files, ORD starts to choke on the number of points and different things that you've got. So having these different files does really help with that. So this is all my 2D mapping. Again, I mapped it in my civil work file, exported that CSV, and just brought it into its own field book in my feature pub file. So I've got that all here. Again, it is a 3D file, although everything's flattened to 0. So I talked about my feature file, my civil files, and then my 2 pub files that I've got, my terrain pub files. So we now need to create a container file of all this. So let me go ahead and do a new file. And I'm going to put it in my number 6 civil data. Again, it is a container file, so I need to use a 2D seed. Terrain-based container file. So again, this is my container file, and it's still loading. So I'm going to wait to push any buttons. But I'm not going to have any actual data in the container file. I'm just going to have references. So I go up and attach my different references that I need. They're all now going to be in my survey folder. So I've got my 2D mapping. I have my terrain, existing topography, and then I have a terrain for the bridge. So I'm going to add all 3 of those. If it's interactive, I can go through and set those logical names and descriptions, which this is the pub. So I'm going to say existing 2D mapping. Say, okay, this is my terrain 01. And my bridge. So now I have all this data aggregated into one container. Actually, the data is not in the container file, but I have all this data referenced in, and this is going to be what I deliver. I now need to set one of these terrains active to create that managed 3D model. So I'm going to select a triangle or any part of that existing topo, use my pop-up display to set as active terrain model. You'll see that 3D model pop in. And I now am good to go to the deliver it. So that would be delivered. We're good to go. Let's say, okay, they've started design. They come back and say, oh, well, you know what? We really need, we're going to have to do some work right here. We really need more topo right there. So as the workflow you use will depend on what type of data you're going to be working with. So if you have field topo files to add to existing terrain, with the method I'm proposing, you could go back into that Civil Work 01 file. You can create a new field book, or if you're using one single field book, you can't do that if you have one single field book. You would have to create a new field book in that Civil Work 01 file. You can make some massages to that topo file, create that SQLite, and then import that SQLite into your Terrain Pub 01, that existing topography field book. And then you can then make some minor modifications in there as you need to merge it together. And I have the question here, why not process it directly in that Terrain publish file? And I think it really depends on how much data you have to add. If it's just 1 or 2 files, it's probably fine to go directly into that Terrain Pub file. But if you have a lot of data, it's probably going to take a little bit of time. You probably want to do most of that in a civil working file and then export those SQLites and bring those SQLites back into your pub file. And that just reduces the editing time in that live file that maybe someone's actually looking at and doing some type of design in. So if you have point cloud data that you need to extract, again, I would go create a civil working file, extract those features in that civil working file, create that CSV, and then import that CSV into your Terrain Pub 01 or whatever file it is you need to do that. And then if the area is outside of your existing terrain, but it's still the same project, they've just moved on, maybe it's an urban project and they added a new intersection somewhere else, so you're going to make a totally new terrain. Again, I would create another civil working file, extract and edit your data for that, and then just do a copy to and rename as that Terrain Pub file. And then you're going to have to go back and reference that Terrain Pub file, that new Terrain Pub file, to your container files. So those are just kind of some scenarios that I came up with. I'm going to demo real fast because we're running a little short on time, how to add some data to that existing topo file, the way I would go about it. See if I can get this out of here. All right. So yeah, like I said, the designers came back, the project team came back and said, oh yeah, we need more data up here to work on our design. We've already published this, so people have been working on it. We don't want to break that link from that existing topography, or maybe they've been targeting other things that they have links to. So we want to keep this the same. So what I'm going to do is I've got point cloud data that I'm going to go extract this from. So I'm going to go create a new civil working file. So that's what I'm calling this next number, civil working file. And I just put in here on the name, it's add request and then whatever date that was. You can be creative with whatever you want to do to keep that straight. So let me go ahead and open that file. So I just went through and, I loaded up my point clouds in here, did my topo dot extraction, and then used my feature code export tool. It's still loading. It'll probably be loading by the time I'm talking still. So I used my feature code export tool to get that CSV, and then I just created a field book here to check it. And I can either export this field book as an SQLite, or if the data is good, I can just import that CSV directly into my Terrain Publish 01 and then make any modifications as needed. So again, I save all this, or have been saving it within ProjectWise. So right here, I've got my CSV that I exported from TopoDot using the feature code export tool. And then within that Terrain Pub 01 file, which is live and has been delivered and is being used, I can then import that additional data. Into my existing topography field book. And it is my add request for additional data. So I've got my additional data added. I have not modified my existing topography terrain modified, but I haven't had to delete it or remove it or anything. I can make some edits here if I need to. I know that my boundary is going to have to be redone. That was my existing boundary right there, but I need to expand my boundary. So I can do that right here. Several different ways to do that. I could have made a graphic in my other file, which probably would have been the most efficient, and then just imported it in here as a generic line and went that route. Does anyone want me to show that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. So let me go back to that other file. I should have done that before, but let me jump back to my civil working 04. I am going to create a field book here. I've already created a field book, but I extracted the topo.features, the F's using the feature code export, created the CSV. I can bring it into a field book in this same file, which I've done. I'm going to go ahead and just create a terrain in here. Create terrain model just for me to use. I can also reference in my terrain pub so I can see what I'm doing, which I've also already done. So this is my terrain pub that I've already delivered so I can see where I'm at. I can go through and modify my edge triangles. Let me go ahead and change this level display, or not level display, but oh, I got the wrong one. It's feature definition. I just want to see contours and triangles. And I'm going to go ahead and turn my reference off because that's going to get a little confusing just for sake of doing this. So I'm going to go edit my terrain essentially here. It's just a working terrain just to extract a graphic of this new boundary. So to do that, I have to deactivate my survey processing rules over in my survey tab. And under my terrain workflow, I can use this edit model option. And I really prefer this delete triangle by line. Following my prompts, I just select my terrain model. And then it asks me to start with doing those edge triangles there. Pretty easy. There's not a whole lot of things here to do. Maybe I don't like that. And all I'm really concerned about probably is this outer edge, because this is going to be bumped up against my other one, but I could go all the way around this if I needed to. That's probably erroneous right there. So once I've got that, I can then go to my boundary options, add boundary. I'm not actually going to add a boundary though. I'm just going to extract a graphic. It's asking me to locate my terrain model. Under your method here, you got different methods. You can extract graphic, add boundary, add ruled boundary. 99% of the time, we only extract graphic. You get into all kinds of rules when you start doing all this adding boundary with this method. So I just extract a graphic of that is all I'm doing. And then I can either bring this into my field book if I'm going that route. If I'm doing the feature code export method, I can bring this into that CSV as well. If I've already done this, it's kind of a bit of a process to do that, but probably the easiest way is just going to be to go into that pub file and reference this file in there and copy that graphic. So let me go back to my pub file. And again, that's just my working file, so I can do whatever I want in there. That's 2D, my terrain pub existing topography. Go ahead and open that one. Check that in. And I really thought I had deleted that additional data that I added there, but I must have the survey processing rules deactivated. No, they're activated. There we go. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and add that new data. I guess I didn't really have to delete it, but it's fine. And then I can just reference in that working file that I did to get that new boundary, if I can find my references dialog. So that was this one. So I'm just going to copy that in here just to have the graphic. Go ahead and turn that off. I'm going to actually detach that because I don't really need it anymore. So now I've got a couple things going on. So I've got this old boundary in there that I actually changed to a generic line, but I want to splice it with this new one. So I can just use microstation commands to do that. And if I can get to them, so I just like to use my break element. I'm going to turn off my terrain. And I'm going to break it there. I'm going to break this other graphic there because I'm going to merge them together. And this may not be the prettiest stuff, but it'll work. Actually, I'm going to break this one up there. So now I'm just going to create a complex shape for that. Go ahead and simplify the geometry. It's going to work its way around. So now I've got this new complex shape. I can go ahead and delete these other two old ones. And it took that generic line out of my survey field book, just totally wiped it out. So I don't even have that in there anymore. But I can now add this. Let me go ahead and add it to my survey field book as a graphic linear feature. Select that new boundary. It's going to come in on the default. So I can go to my pop-up display, change that field code to BX, and set that to determine by feature definition. When I turn this back on, my triangles now match that new boundary. And what I was wanting to show you is that that container file has now been updated, and I have not even touched really this existing topography terrain model. So let me go open the container file just to prove to you that it has updated, which is under the 6 civil data, and we're right at 330. So hopefully, maybe you learned something new with this one. I, do a lot of the work in those civil working files and then pump it up to that publish file. It makes minimal editing time on these live files that they're doing. So I'm open to suggestions too.
Sounds good. That was kind of what I had in mind for how I was going to go about doing it.
Mm-hmm. All right. If there's nothing else, thank you all.